Hello everyone and welcome to week 7 of Poll 101, American National Government. This week we'll be discussing the pivotal role the media plays in American politics. I want to begin with a discussion on the significance of the free media, which, as you should certainly know by now, is protected by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. Then we'll shift to the actual politics of the media as an institution. Who owns media networks? How does this influence the type of stories media networks share with individuals? We'll also talk briefly about the 3 major media formats and how content and quality varies across print, broadcast, and digital media. Finally, we'll conclude with an assessment of the current state of the media, fake news, and media bias. So with that being said, let's get started. Freedom of the press. A critical component of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution is the right to report news or circulate opinions without censorship from the government. The right to a free press was considered one of the bulwarks of liberty by the Founding Fathers of the United States. But before the 13 colonies declared independence from Great Britain, the British government attempted to censor the American media by prohibiting newspapers from publishing unfavorable information and opinions. So you can see, whoever controls the media controls what kind of information is, and more importantly, what information is not presented to its viewers. So the old adage is true: knowledge is power. Strip your citizens of knowledge, and you strip them of their power. Consider the way the media works in authoritarian regimes like North Korea. Radio and TV sets in North Korea are sold pre-tuned to government broadcast stations, and radios must be checked and registered with the police. As you can imagine, the government-sponsored media only tells positive and flattering stories of the government. Moreover, internet access in North Korea is highly restricted, and only a small section of elites who have received state approval can access the internet. Again, knowledge is power. When you deprive individuals of knowledge and information, they are inherently powerless. And that's why it's so critical for a democracy in which the power of the government rests with the people, that citizens have access to media that is able to operate without interference from the government or big corporations. Now, while the news media networks in America are not controlled or censored by the government and are, of course, significantly less restrained than those in authoritarian countries, the American news media might not be as free as you think it is. According to a 2020 report by Reporters Without Borders, or RSF, the United States ranks 45th globally on its World Press Freedom Index. What exactly do we mean by free press? Well, RSF takes 7 distinct criteria into account: the extent to which different ideas and opinions are represented in the media, the extent to which the media operates without governmental, religious, or corporate interference, the degree of censorship, transparency, and hostility or violence used against journalists. When we look at the United States ranking in more detail, we see that Donald Trump is presented front and center as the key explanatory variable. And while the purpose of this class is not to debate whether Donald Trump is a good or bad president, or what criteria we would even use to surmise such judgment, we can and should look at the president and his administration's relationship with the media. Under President Trump, the White House has strategically replaced traditional forms of press access with those that limit the ability of journalists to ask questions of the administration. Daily, televised press briefings, led by the press secretary, were canceled for more than 400 days between March 2019 and May 2020. And since then, the federal government has made multiple attempts to deny specific journalists and news outlets, particularly those seen with a liberal bias, access to other opportunities for press engagement. So I think we've got 2 major points here that need to be reconciled. First is the matter of the First Amendment and free speech and freedom of the press. And second is the Trump administration, which has made no secret its disdain for liberal media, fake news, and barring certain outlets from White House events. But is this a violation of the First Amendment? Well, technically, no. According to the courts, the government cannot interfere with a journalist or publisher's intent to publish information. This is referred to as prior restraint. But the government can interfere with who is allowed access to various government officials. In a 1972 case, the Supreme Court decided that journalists have no right, at least under the First Amendment, to demand any greater access to government officials than what is already provided to ordinary citizens. So really, this all boils down to the role and access that we think the media should have in politics. But if people believe that the media should have equal access to government officials, meaning both conservative and liberal media outlets and government-sponsored events, pressure needs to be put on Congress to enact such a law. And while we're on the topic, let's shift our focus to some of the key landmark court cases that have defined the boundaries of free press in the United States. So as we discussed in the Civil Liberties lecture, which focused on the Bill of Rights and protections from government interference, we know that there are no absolutes when it comes to such freedoms. Not all speech is protected speech. The right to bear arms doesn't mean you get to stockpile machine guns. Police cannot search your property without a warrant unless some ambiguously defined exigent circumstance or probable cause is present, and so on and so on and so on. There are no absolutes. The rights of the press is no exception. Over the years, the courts have played a pivotal role in determining the scope and boundaries of the press, and there's two major issues that I want to discuss: prior restraint, media leaks, and whistleblowing. Now, the video I'm about to show does a really great job at summarizing a whole lot of material. It talks about prior restraint, which is when the government tries to suppress publication of certain materials, highlighted in the New York Times Company versus United States Supreme Court case, also known as the Pentagon Papers, how WikiLeaks leaked confidential reports and information via the internet, and finally discusses how whistleblowing is at the center of each of these issues and whether going to the media is the only option for whistleblowers. So let's take a look.
In the United States, around 3 million people work with classified information as part of their job. That includes people who work in the military, for government agencies like the CIA, or for private companies hired by those agencies. Let's say you are one of those people, and you learn something that bothers you. Because this is your job, you know that the laws around classified information are serious. But let's say the thing you learn is really bad. Maybe a government program is wasting billions of taxpayer dollars, or a federal agency is spying on millions of ordinary Americans, or the head of your government is making shadowy deals with foreign leaders for personal gain. You have a decision to make, a sort of choose-your-own adventure, but behind each door is a different set of risks. If you decide to expose what you've learned, that's called whistleblowing, and in the US, it's often regarded as a brave, patriotic thing to do. There are laws to protect it. But the reality for the 3 million people who work with classified information is much more complicated. What would you do? This is Daniel Ellsberg, an American military analyst in the 1960s. Ellsberg learned that the US government had lied to the public about why the US was at war in Vietnam and about how deadly the war was. In 1971, he gave 7,000 classified documents that exposed those lies to the New York Times, and then to 20 other newspapers. Ellsberg took door number 1, leaking your evidence of government wrongdoing directly to the media. His leak became known as the Pentagon Papers. 3 years later, the US pulled out of the war.
Bring peace with honor in Vietnam.
But leaking classified information to the media is illegal. And in Ellsberg's case, the government made him a target.
We've got to keep our eye on the main ball. The main ball's Ellsberg. We got to get this son of a bitch.
The federal government charged Ellsberg under the Espionage Act, a law from 1917 originally written to go after spies working with foreign governments. But Ellsberg got lucky. It turned out that the government had broken the law by spying on him, and a judge threw out the charges. He was free to go. But other leakers haven't been so lucky. Chelsea Manning, an American soldier, leaked classified documents to WikiLeaks in 2010, including evidence that the US had committed war crimes in Iraq. She went to prison for 7 years. In 2013, the cybersecurity expert Edward Snowden leaked evidence of a massive government surveillance program to international newspapers. He fled the United States to avoid being prosecuted for espionage. Leaking classified information to the media is one common kind of whistleblowing, but it's also illegal, so it's treacherous for those that risk it. Fortunately, in the US, there's another option: to go through official internal channels for coming forward with a complaint. This is door number 2, legal whistleblowing. In 1998, the US created a process for people who work with classified information to file complaints, first to an inspector general, and then to the director of national intelligence, and then on to Congress. This is someone who worked in national security at the time. His name is Thomas Drake. Shortly after September 11th, Drake learned that the National Security Agency was part of an unprecedented program inside the federal government called Stellar Wind. The program collected emails, phone conversations, financial transactions, and the web activity of millions of American citizens without a warrant.
What are we doing violating the Constitution? I knew that if I remained silent, that I would be complicit in a crime.
Drake considered taking what he knew to the press, but knew it would put him at risk.
I knew that that was fraught with enormous peril. I was extremely familiar with what happened to Daniel Ellsberg.
Luckily, he had a legal route he could follow. He brought his concerns to his supervisor, to his own agency's inspector general's office, and eventually to Congress. But his agency told him that no matter what the Constitution said, the White House said the program was legal and that that was good enough for them.
I could feel the hair standing up on the back of my neck because I was thrown back to the 70s and Nixon.
Drake's next problem was that the 1998 law he had been following didn't do anything to protect him against retaliation. Drake's identity became public within his agency, and he was gradually pushed out of his job.
I was increasingly isolated. They finally removed me from all positions, all responsibilities, all programs. There's no recourse and no penalty if the agency decides to retaliate against you.
Finally, after Drake's complaints went nowhere, he chose a different path. He went to the media, and because he remembered what happened to Ellsberg, he chose to share unclassified information, which meant it was legal. But then, in 2010, the Obama administration accused him of violating the Espionage Act, the same as Ellsberg, who had leaked classified information.
Thomas Drake is charged with violating espionage laws.
Prosecutors claimed that Drake had betrayed his country.
Drake's case was only the 4th time in history that the Espionage Act had been used to prosecute a whistleblower. But since the Obama administration, it's become a lot more common. Eventually, the case collapsed because Drake did nothing illegal, but his career in the government was over. Today, he works at an Apple store.
The price is enormous. I have no retirement. That's gone. You lose your entire social network in terms of work. There's people who lost their jobs because of their association with me. Those are burdens that I will carry with me the rest of my life.
In August 2019, an officer in the CIA filed a whistleblower complaint, saying that President Trump was trying to pressure Ukraine to investigate one of his political rivals. Just like Drake, the officer followed the process laid out in the law. He took the complaint to the Inspector General. The Inspector General took it to the Director of National Intelligence. Then it stopped. The Director of National Intelligence never brought it to Congress. So the Inspector General went over his head.
Deeply disturbing what we read this morning.
I'm announcing the House of Representatives moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry.
Testimony from witnesses in the impeachment investigation has backed up almost everything laid out in the whistleblower complaint. And whistleblower protections were updated in 2012 with more explicit language saying the government can't retaliate against a whistleblower the way they did against Thomas Drake. So the whistleblower should be protected. But where the laws still fall short is whether it's a crime to reveal a whistleblower's identity to the public. That's what the president and his allies are hoping to do next.
There's no law that prevents me from mentioning the name of who's been said to be the whistleblower.
The whistleblower should be revealed.
The parts of the government that deal in secrecy are also the least accountable to the public. And whistleblowers in those agencies are some of the only ways wrongdoing there might ever come to light. But the system fails them. And every retaliation sends a clear message. If both leaking and legal whistleblowing leave government whistleblowers vulnerable, this system will push more and more people who know something's wrong into door number 3, doing nothing at all.
So one of the things this video importantly points out is that the media is not the only option for whistleblowers who want to call attention to government wrongdoing. As the video mentions, there are legal frameworks in place within our own government that allow whistleblowers to come forward and share troubling information with either the Director of National Intelligence or Congress. But such channels come with their own sets of issues and problems and can still be obfuscated by government officials who wish to conceal or disregard such claims. So considering the legal and professional risks of leaking information to the media, what do you think government officials should do when they learn the government is lying to the people or violating citizens' constitutional right to privacy? It's a complicated question, and we should ask ourselves what role we expect the media to play in kind of regulating politics and holding politicians accountable. Another concerning issue regarding American media is the lack of diversity in media ownership. In 1983, 50 corporations controlled most of the American media, including magazines, books, music, news feeds, newspapers, movies, radio, television. Today, 6 giant media conglomerates control 90% of all media consumed by Americans. And what's concerning here is that as media control falls into fewer hands, the risk increases that politicians and citizens who express less popular or minority viewpoints will have difficulty finding a public forum. And because most media is privatized and ran by profit-motivated businesses, that means that the primary objective of modern media is to sell audiences to advertisers, not to inform a democratic citizenry. The lack of diversity in media ownership and its profit-motivated business model is one of the key reasons why media has become increasingly biased, polarized, and partisan. I'm so excited that we're discussing the media this week because it coincides with a very special event here at UWL, Free Speech Week. This week, Vanessa Otero, the founder of Ad Fontes Media and the Media Bias Chart, is giving a special virtual presentation on media bias and political polarization this Thursday, October 22nd, from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. And if you have not done so already, I highly encourage you to RSVP for this event at uwlax.edu/go/free-speech. Students who attend the event and write a one-page summary of what they learned can earn up to 5 bonus points of extra credit added to your final grade. So please go to the link, register, participate in the event, write up a short analysis of what you learned, and earn some extra credit. Otero's Media Bias Chart is a unique way of analyzing America's complex media landscape on 2 dimensions: reliability on the y-axis and bias on the x-axis. Now here's a quick 4-minute video which details her methodology and what to expect during Otero's talk this week.
A couple of years ago, patent attorney Vanessa Otero ran into a problem that just about anyone who's active on social media will recognize.
It really started in 2016 in the run-up to the last presidential election. I just started becoming very alarmed about the kind of quality and bias of information that people would use to support their arguments to their friends on Facebook. I thought it might be helpful to just kind of map it, like better, worse, left and right. So I just started piecing it together on my own just to explain to my friends. We've had this overabundance and proliferation of online news sources, and most of it is in the area of analysis and opinion. If people understood that the sources they're consuming are actively making them angrier and polarizing them, then they might choose to consume less of that.
Otero's chart categorizes the media landscape using two domains: facts versus editorializing, and left versus right-leaning views.
It's a two-dimensional taxonomy. So the vertical axis is quality. So in general, the better quality, best quality stuff is at the top, and the lowest quality stuff is at the bottom. The horizontal axis is bias. So you have like your neutral or balanced stuff in the middle.
Viewers will recognize big names like CNN and Fox News, but Otero says she's starting to get requests to add smaller outlets too. Extreme partisan sources like Breitbart and Wonkette appear at the ends of the axes. As a whole, the chart provides a frame of reference for a news industry that is growing increasingly partisan.
So much of the the content that we consume right now is telling you how you should feel about a subject. The stories, like when they break, and then what the spin on them, the takes on them 24 hours later, are really revealing.
Believe it or not, social scientists don't think the polarized media climate has done much permanent damage to democracy yet. But it's not exactly harmless either. An analysis of Nielsen data from the Knight Foundation shows a widening gap between liberals who say they trust the media and conservatives who say they don't. The Pew Research Center finds that the most partisan among us are more likely to be steering the broader political conversation. A comprehensive chart of political media, then, could serve as a sort of guide for those who want to make up their own minds. Or, to hear Otero tell it,
what the media bias chart is an anchor.
Of course, Otero is just one person with her own biases and blind spots.
I've taken into account certain criticisms. I have actually made adjustments to certain sources, especially from some of the really earlier versions. If the sample was really unfair that I selected, and I can go back and look at that and take those comments into account, especially if I get those comments from a lot of the readers of that source and other sources.
Until now, Otero has mostly managed the project herself. But she recently finished crowdfunding more than $32,000 to hire more analysts, vet more sources, and make her charting process more transparent.
Right now there are 104 sources. We'd like to include, you expand to 200, 300, 400 sources pretty soon on an interactive web-based version. But there's a limit to what I can do on my own. I've developed really robust methodologies, really granular methodologies. The headline, the picture or graphic, the lead or the chyron, and then the individual sentences for quality and bias. I've just started recruiting a team of analysts to help me do that. I just really felt a responsibility to improve that as much as I could because people are relying on it. And I just fundamentally feel that if you're going to put out information that influences people, which this does, then you have a responsibility to make it as good as you can.
In the future, Otero hopes her chart could be a sort of Consumer Reports for media ratings, both in terms of its comprehensive reach and its reputation as a reliable guide.
I want to make the news consumers smarter and the news media itself better. And those things are both really lofty, but I think it's doable. There are folks who just, if they had this information, would make better choices as consumers of media first and then citizens.
So as you noticed in the video, there's a wide variety of media formats that people consume: print, television or broadcast, and digital news or new media, and each comes with its own set of pros and cons. Most notably, print media is perhaps the most sophisticated and deeply detailed stories written by professional journalists. The content of print media stories also tends to be less biased, but not always. Like the New York Times, for example, is one of the few major newspapers that remains publicly traded and is not owned by any massive media conglomerate like we discussed earlier. Television news is more ubiquitous but lacks the depth and detail of print media. Broadcast media also has to be extremely cognizant of attracting viewers, which is why stories frequently feature a salacious or scandalous spin to get viewers to tune in. Accidental exposure is also more common among broadcast and digital media. This means that you may come across a story or headline on accident and engage with information or material that you otherwise may not have sought out independently. For instance, if you leave the TV on while doing homework or chores or whatever, and you overhear a story that catches your attention, that's called accidental exposure. So you can see accidental exposure is extremely unlikely with print news. You don't just fall into a newspaper and accidentally read the story. Lastly, new media or digital media is often labeled as the least sophisticated or least trustworthy because anyone can post anything. Take blogs, for example. Anyone can start one, say whatever they want, and there's virtually no accountability, no editor to proof a story, and no pressure to be factual or impartial. And this is particularly why online media is so vulnerable to misinformation. Couple this with the fact that individuals are constantly sharing stories on social media with their social networks, which makes accidental exposure to all types of information and disinformation extremely more likely. So keeping the differences of each media format in mind, let's talk a little bit about how demographic predictors of which type of media you're most likely to consume might impact how informed you are overall. A 2019 report by the RAND Corporation shows that Americans are most likely to get their news from either television or online. And interestingly, we see print media, which we know to be the most sophisticated form of media, is consumed the least. And in this chart, we see significant generational, racial, and socioeconomic differences in media consumption. One of the most concerning is the social media column here. Younger Americans, particularly those without college degrees, are most likely to get their news from social media. And this is concerning because the group who ostensibly possesses the largest informational gap is getting most of their news from platforms that are the most vulnerable to misinformation. The way that we consume media, the formats we rely on, as well as our own demographic and socioeconomic characteristics, play a big role in determining how reliable we perceive the news media to be. Men, whites, those with a college degree, those with higher income, and those who are retired are most likely to find today's news unreliable. Whereas on the other hand, women, blacks and Hispanics, those without a college degree, and those with lower incomes and working people find the news more reliable in general. So altogether, I think this paints a pretty divided picture of Americans and how we consume media and the types of opinions we have about the media and our willingness to trust that media, our willingness to trust information as legitimate and true. And this is a perfect segue into our final topic of today's lecture, trust in the media. And I'm going to leave you with a thought-provoking TED Talk by Sharyl Attkisson, an Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist who, interestingly enough, has faced allegations of purveying fake news herself, particularly regarding her reporting that suggested a link between vaccines and autism. She's also faced significant criticism for creating her own media bias chart, similar to Vanessa Otero's that we discussed earlier in the lecture, which many have claimed labels anything not overtly conservative as leftist. Nonetheless, I think Attkisson raises some interesting points in this TED Talk that links a lot of the material from today's lecture, so be sure to watch the video all the way through, as you will see some questions from the video in the lecture quiz at the end of this module.
As an investigative journalist, I found myself with a few questions about the emergence of fake news as a phrase and as a fad. Number one, what is fake news and what is not? Number 2, when did fake news begin? And number 3, most interesting of all, I've investigated the shadowy multi-billion-dollar industry that seeks to manipulate all of us through news, social media, and online. So I wondered, who's behind the massive effort to direct our attention onto fake news? Is fake news real? First, the definition of fake news depends on where you sit. It's not as if there's an extreme dictionary authority that gets to decide for everybody, though some are trying, more on that in a moment. But when did fake news under anybody's definition begin? Well, fake news has always been embedded in our culture. It just wasn't called that. The supermarket rags gave popular rise to blatantly fake news, with front-page images of aliens impregnating unsuspecting, usually large-breasted earthling women. Most people probably believe little to nothing of what they read in these publications. A few people might have believed everything. But there are countless examples of fake news surfacing in mainstream news. Example, in 1996, a news media frenzy wrongly blamed a security guard named Richard Jewell for the Atlanta Olympic bombing. We later learned that poor Jewell had actually been a hero, moving people away from a suspicious backpack before it exploded. On 9/11, a network TV news reporter falsely reported that a terrorist plane had crashed in the presidential retreat Camp David. Never happened. The internet revolutionized fake news, whether we're talking about a rumor or intentional disinformation or biased, sloppy, erroneous reporting. What would have circulated amongst a relative few could now develop a global following overnight. Example, in 2012, 26 people were murdered at Sandy Hook Elementary. Blogs and social media immediately began circulating rumors and images, insisting the whole thing was a hoax drummed up by the government and staged by actors. In 2014, Rolling Stone magazine reported on a sensational case of a fraternity gang rape that turned out to be so unsubstantiated that Rolling Stone retracted the article and the reporter was found guilty of malice in a defamation lawsuit. And whatever you think of the 2014 police shooting of Michael Brown, even the Obama Justice Department eventually ruled that the entire hands up, don't shoot scenario, which blanketed the news day in and day out, was probably fabricated and that the police officer acted in legitimate self-defense. But it wasn't until 2016 that the actual phrase fake news was introduced to the American public on a national scale. Liberals were first to heavily promote use of the phrase, referring to conservative disinformation and right-wing websites, and there's certainly plenty of that. Example, as Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton battled it out, a website called the Conservative Daily Post published a huge amount of pro-Trump, anti-Clinton propaganda under the name and likeness of a former beauty queen named Laura Hunter. But the real Laura Hunter says she didn't write any of those articles. She claims imposters turned her into a spokesman for a radical right-wing website that peddles fake news. She sued them. Meantime, Trump and conservatives counterpunch with their own notion of fake news, meaning biased, sloppy, erroneous reporting, as committed by the mainstream media and the left. Plenty of that, too. Example, on President Trump's first day in office, a Time magazine reporter falsely reported that Trump had removed the bust statue of Martin Luther King from the Oval Office. The White House quickly tweeted out a photo showing the statue was still very much there. The reporter, perhaps blinded by his own bias, hadn't followed the most basic tenets of beginning journalism: check your facts. So if fake news by other names has always been around, why does it suddenly become the stuff of daily headlines during the 2016 campaign? I did a little digging and I traced the effort to a nonprofit called First Draft, which appears to be about the first to use the phrase fake news in its modern context. On September 13th, 2016, First Draft announced a partnership to tackle malicious hoaxes and fake news reports. The goal was supposedly to separate wheat from chaff, to prevent unproven conspiracy talk from figuring prominently in internet searches, to relegate today's version of the alien baby story to a special internet oblivion. Exactly 1 month later, President Obama chimed in. He insisted in a speech that he too thought somebody needed to step in and curate information in this wild, wild west media environment. Nobody in the public had been clamoring for any such thing. Yet suddenly, the topic of fake news dominates headlines on a daily basis. It's as if the media had been given its marching orders. Fake news, they insisted, was an imminent threat to American democracy. But as somebody who studied the industry that seeks to manipulate all of us on behalf of paid interests, I know that few themes arise in our environment organically. A noted propagandist told me, "It's like a movie," he said, and it gave me chills at the time. Nearly every scene or image that crosses our path in daily life, he said, was put there for a reason, often by someone who paid a lot of money to place it there. What if the whole anti-fake news campaign was an effort on somebody's part to keep us from seeing or believing certain websites and stories by controversializing them or labeling them as fake news? But who would want to do such a thing? When connecting the dots, I find it often helps to follow the money. I wanted to know who was funding the nonprofit First Draft and its anti-fake news effort. I found the answer. It was Google. Google's parent company Alphabet was run by a man named Eric Schmidt. Eric Schmidt, as it happens, had devoted himself to Hillary Clinton's election campaign, offered himself up as a campaign advisor, and became a top multi-million-dollar donor to it. His company funded First Draft around the start of the election cycle. Not surprisingly, Hillary was soon to jump aboard the anti-fake news train, and her surrogate David Brock of Media Matters privately told donors he was the one who convinced Facebook to join the effort. I'm not the only one who thinks the whole thing smacked of the rollout of a propaganda campaign. Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept wrote, "The most important fact you need to realize is that those who most loudly denounce fake news are typically the ones most aggressively disseminating it." But something happened that nobody expected. The anti-fake news campaign backfired. Each time advocates cried fake news, Donald Trump called them fake news until he'd co-opted the term so completely that even those who were originally promoting it started running from it, including the Washington Post, which in January of 2017 wrote, "It's time to retire the tainted term fake news." In fact, it's now commonly misreported that it was Donald Trump who thought up the phrase. Actually, it was just a hostile takeover. Suffice it to say that each side now defines fake news in terms that call the other guy into question. So, what's the lesson in all of this? I'm not here to litigate who's right, but I can tell you there are two ways to tell that powerful interests might be trying to manipulate your opinion. Number one, when the media seems to be trying to shape or censor facts and opinions rather than report them. Number two, when so many in the media are reporting the same stories, promulgating the same narratives, relying on the same sources, even using the same phrases. I mean, think of it. There are literally thousands of legitimate news stories that could be reported in a given day and an infinite number of ways to report them. When everybody's on the same page, it might be the result of an organized campaign. I'll leave you with a final thought and a warning. It's about a new catchphrase being bandied about, media literacy, as in we'll tell you who to trust and who not to trust. Media literacy advocates are busy trying to get state laws passed to require that their version of media literacy be taught in public schools. They're developing websites as resources for journalists and the public. They're partnering with universities. I think media literacy is a new name promoted by some of the same people who want to tell you what to believe. People with their own agendas using terms designed to fool you into thinking they're neutral authorities. What you need to remember is that when interests are working this hard to shape your opinion, their true goal might just be to add another layer between you and the truth.
Alright guys, that's it for this week's lecture. I hope you enjoyed the content and the selected videos. Stay healthy, stay safe, and as always, thanks for watching.